Yes, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled Raising the Bar, Will New Policies Deliver Higher Carbon Credit Quality? It's great to see so many attendees. So the speakers for today's webinar include our CEO, Guy Turner, and our analysts, Maudie Cooper and Ben St. Laurent from our policy team, as well as Chris Leeds, Head of Carbon Market Development at Standard Chartered Bank. The webinar will begin with a presentation from the Trove team, followed by reflections by our guest speaker, and then an open Q&A. Before we begin, I would just like to go over a couple of house rules. So all attendees are automatically muted throughout the webinar. And if you would like to ask a question at any point, please enter it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. I will then facilitate a Q&A session at the end. The slides, along with the recording of this webinar, will be uploaded to the Trove Research website tomorrow. And please feel free to share these with your colleagues and around your organisation. I will now hand over to Guy, who will begin the presentation.
Thanks, Ashni, and hello to everybody. It's good to see everyone again. So we hold a number of these webinars, and this one is a very topical one on quality, and it's great to have Chris joining us later. Just a quick update on Trove Research and the platform Trove Intelligence. For those who don't know, we are a data and analyst company specifically focused on the carbon credit markets. And we have teams of policy experts. We track all projects and transactions. We look at carbon credit prices on a very granular level. And we monitor all of the corporate climate activity and their use of carbon credits. And we merge all of these with our forecasting work, which is available through a variety of online platforms and dashboards. And very soon, you will see a new version of Trove. So keep a lookout for the new web presence that we'll have, and this web in our recording will be uploaded to that as soon as it's up and running. So carbon credit quality is an extremely hot topic, and we wanted to give our thoughts on where the world of initiatives are to try and tackle this issue. So first of all, we'll look at what is carbon credit quality, what does it mean, why it matters, and then touch on the main initiatives that have been launched or have been around for a while, some of them, to deal with this. The CORSIA scheme, the ICVCM core carbon principles, the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, the ISSB in terms of its work on the disclosure of the use of carbon credits, and then some final thoughts. First of all, why is carbon credit quality important? Well, it's at the heart of the voluntary carbon market. It was identified as the key impediment to growth and scale of the voluntary carbon market by the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Market back in 2020 and 2021, with 45% of buyers surveyed identifying it as a pain point. And that issue has not gone away in spite of progress. And everyone on this call will probably be aware of news articles, somewhat provocative in certain cases, some truthful, some not, looking to find fault with projects and the process of creating carbon credits. What does quality mean in the context of a carbon credit? Really, it refers to three types of issues. One is how much CO2 is actually reduced or removed. Second, how does a project reduce or remove CO2? What's its process? And then thirdly, how are credits reviewed and used? And in the reduction or removal piece, it relates to concepts such as additionality, the baseline that was used, quantification and verification, and issues of permanence, how long that project is going to stay doing what it's supposed to be doing. How does a project reduce or remove CO2? They're all of the additional aspects that a project can deliver. So community engagement, social and benefits, other externalities, ecosystem benefits, and on the negative side, perhaps financial or crime or fraud that may underlie any kind of investment or transaction. And then thirdly, how are credits reviewed or used. That relates to the accounting or double counting and disclosure of the carbon credit by the buyer. And these can operate at three levels: program level, the project type level, so they can be categorized under different project types, or at the individual project level. And that matrix, that universe, creates quite a lot of complexity. And I would like to have added up all the pages of guidance and methodologies that have been written on this subject, both throughout the registry, in the registries and the standard setting bodies, and in the guidance documents, but I fear it would have run to thousands and thousands of pages. This is a complex area, and one that sort of has exercised a lot of experts. Just on the issue of why, on this issue of how much CO2 is reduced, in addition the concept of additionality and baselines, just so that we're all on the same page here. Under the carbon credit process is what's referred to as a baseline and credit system, and it differs from another type of emissions trading scheme called the cap and trade scheme, which we have in Europe under the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and in California, which is capped. Now, the California scheme can import carbon credits, but the concept is if a company has a growing emissions and it's capped, then the emissions need to be held within that cap. And they can do so by either reducing emissions or acquiring allowances from another entity that is within that boundary under that cap. So no matter what the level of activity from an individual company, collectively, all of those emissions must meet that cap or be beneath it. They cannot be greater than the total sum of the emissions. Under a baseline and credit scheme, a company with a voluntary target, for example, may have set its own target. There will be that, it will have that target, and then its emissions in the future may grow, or even if the target is declining, the emissions are above the target. If it wants to use a carbon credit, then it does so from a project that lies outside that company's boundary. And it can calculate, the credit is calculated, not with reference to a cap, but with reference to that project's baseline. And in this example here, the future emissions are deemed to be lower than the expected growth in emissions of that project. And that baseline effectively determines how many carbon credits are generated. In another situation, if the baseline is different, if the counterfactual view differs from what was originally claimed, then the number of credits issued will be different. So it's incredibly important that for the integrity of the system to be maintained, that those baselines are set objectively and robustly. And that is why one reason why why there is so much attention on additionality in the whole carbon credit quality process. The quality of a carbon credit is reflected today already within the market to some degree. This is the weekly pricing report that we assemble and publish, and you can see there the difference between the nature restoration projects, the red, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and non-CO2 gases, and the attributes of those projects, the underlying quality, the implied quality, as well as the additional attributes, determine quite a significant spread in prices. And when you look at the vintage spread, older credits trade at lower prices. And our indexes show that pre-2012 credits have traded at a 30 to 40% discount to post-2012 vintages since the start of this year. So the market is already reflecting aspects of quality and integrity to some degree. But just as to sort of put a horror show up, why does this seem such like a thorny and perplexing issue? Well, when you look at the number of organizations that are trying to influence this space, to encourage companies to adopt net zero targets, far-reaching climate commitments, and make sure that the carbon credit generation process is valid and supports those longer-term climate goals. And this is something that we spend a lot of time tracking. We model and assess the progress of all of these organizations. You can see we've just highlighted in pink here the key organizations that are driving quality, but it's a big field, and that's just the first page. There's another page as well, and so it is a complex field. There's a lot of voices to be heard, and some of the initiatives like the ICVCM and CORSIA help distill those debates. So it's moving. And it is moving. There's progress. So some of the recent updates and developments that we've seen in VERA, Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, and ART, the Architecture for Red Transactions, have shown progress, are changing their standards. They're changing how they do things. So nesting has been introduced by VERA for red. In strengthening jurisdictional and nested frameworks for red. Renewable energy projects no longer accepted in projects other than least developed countries. Gold Standard introduced early this year, a protocol for corresponding adjustments to be included within its registry for projects, and then updated that again. To allow VERs to be issued without corresponding adjustments and giving flexibility in that area. The American Carbon Registry is updating its protocols for improved forest management with additionality safeguards and more transparency and baseline reporting. So really learning whilst doing, I think, is the way they're approaching it. And the ARC Trees has released its second guidance for jurisdictional red. So progress is being made at the registry level. And so within that background, we dive into a number of the key initiatives. The first one we want to look at is CORSIA, the Carbon Offset and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It was set up in adopted in 2016 to achieve carbon neutral growth from the aviation sector. International aviation sector, originally from 2020, but because of the COVID pandemic has been backdated to 2019, and is due to be phased in, pilot phase 2021 to 2023, second phase 24 to 26, and then second phase 27 to 2035. 115 countries currently participating. It includes sustainable aviation fuels as well as carbon offsets, and has developed an extensive rule set. A lot of experts and a lot of time has gone into it. Carbon Offset Reduction Scheme. The program design, you'll see a lot of the same elements reflected in the ICVCM CCPs, in the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, and various other quality sort of rating processes. They all tend to sort of coalesce around the same themes: program governance, quantification of reductions and removals, third-party validation and verification, ensuring no double counting, ensuring good registry standards in terms of data handling and data management, mitigation activity information, so additional information around the project, sustainable development impacts and safeguards, so do no harm, and full transparency and public participation. And then those that relate specifically to criteria, the integrity criteria, to ensure that projects are additional, based on realistic and credible baselines, as I said, are quantified, monitored and reported and verified, have clear transparency, chain of custody, represent permanent emission reductions, assess and mitigate against potential increase in emissions elsewhere. So this concept of leakage, only accounted once towards a mitigation obligation, and do no net harm. And in the case of CORSIA, on top of all of those things, the credits will have to have a corresponding adjustment if they're used against airline commitments under the scheme. which is a significant change from issue that CORSIA has to deal with that other voluntary schemes do not at the moment. And at first viewing, the CORSIA scheme is relatively inclusive. It has eligibility, allows eligibility for projects and credits from a number of registries: ACR in America, Arteries to China, GHG and Voluntary Emission Reduction Program, Clean Development Mechanism, CAR in the US, Global Carbon Council, Gold Standard, and Verified Carbon Standard. But, and very importantly, it makes a number of exclusions. So within those registries, not all projects can be processed and used for CORSIA eligibility. For example, in the US, anything that's related to renewable energy certificates, early action are excluded. In the China scheme, more technical projects are excluded, so afforestation, reforestation, CCS, non-CO, nitric oxide, nitrous oxide, F-gases, agricultural methods are excluded. Clean Development Mechanism excludes RED per se, but RED Plus is also excluded from a number of other programs for eligibility under CORSIA. And the list goes on. Global Carbon Council includes nuclear technology in its list of projects, as well as CCUS and a whole host of positively listed technologies. Those are excluded from CORSIA on the basis that each project needs to demonstrate its additionality independently of a positive list. Forecast credits sometimes find their way into some registries, particularly CAR and Gold Standard. Those are excluded, and a number of projects can be excluded for lack of wider SDGs. So the scheme is starting to change the way in which credits are used for the airline industry in particular, and I believe has also been used quite extensively as a platform for the ICVCM and what was the TSVCM prior to that. Some programs are rejected outright in CORSIA, so Red Dot Plus, PAT scheme in India, ProClima, and Sur Carbono in Colombia. So things have been moved. The goalposts are moving there. On to the ICVCM, the Integrity Council on the voluntary carbon market. Mordy, my colleague, will just go into this in a little more detail, but very, very briefly, it was set up following the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets to focus on this very, very crucial issue of quality. It's a very influential organization. It's supported by a number of notable entities such as EDF, High Tide, Nature Conservancy, WRI, HM Treasury, WBCSD, etc. Is focusing exclusively on the issue of integrity. It's developed 10 core carbon principles and an assessment framework to go along with it. And as Chris will come on to tell you shortly, there's a very busy period now. This week there are thematic deep dives on the key issues that they're grappling with, and the consultation which they have out is open for consultation until the 27th of this month. So pausing for breath, I will hand over to my colleague Mordy in the policy team, who's done a little more work looking at the next level down in terms of the core carbon principles.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. So here we have a breakdown of the 10 CCPs, and to the right we have we're demonstrating the degree of controversy or impact from each of them. So as we can see, additionality. The additionality methodology has a more impact than some of the other things, particularly they under the CCPs were reducing or getting rid of any projects that would not have happened in the absence of carbon credit revenue, which is not yet mandated by many of the registries. And also projects which have already been mandated in a jurisdiction legally will no longer be considered additional. This is going to take out quite a lot of projects actually currently. Next For number 2, you see the mitigation activity information. This mandates publicly available information where there is a lack of disclosure from certain registries currently. This may cause some issue with some of the North American registries due to tighter allowances on publicly disclosed information in the US. No double counting has already been dealt with fairly well, but permanence is another point of contention, with any risk of reversal having to be fully compensated. The CCPs are also moving towards rejecting or moving away from the 10-year accounting system, whilst registries were sort of accelerating towards this. So that could be another point of contention. Elsewhere, there's a push in general for more conservative approaches, for robust quantification of baselines, and a much fuller methodology for sustainable development impacts, including full reports on gender provisions and a rejection of the introduction of non-native invasive species, which could also have a lot of impact on ARR or afforestation projects. Lastly, number 10, further elucidation is needed on the transition to net zero, as it is not yet clear what lock-in technologies are precisely and what is meant by the best available technology in a given area. Next slide, please, guys. So here we have broken these down per the major registries as tracked by Trove Intelligence. All need more development in order to meet the CCPs, though double counting and claiming is fairly well handled universally, as we can see there with the double ticks, meaning meets the requirement for the full CCP threshold. Clearly, more reporting is needed around sustainable development impacts, as well as needing to prove that the project was only created for carbon credit purposes. So there's a lack of compliance in general with the principles across all of the main registries is the key takeaway from this slide. So here we have applied the CCP methodology for additionality onto a sample of projects, 1,175, including their project documentation, to see how many projects would actually pass this criteria. The first step, the financial additionality step, requires the project type level to give 3 internal rate of return figures. So that's the pre-credit, the benchmark, and the post-credit IRR, in order to show that carbon finance makes the project financially viable. Of what the projects sampled, only 16% of these had all 3 of those figures provided. To meet the very high likelihood of additionality factor, a project needs to demonstrate, or project level needs to demonstrate, poor financial attractiveness. This means that there should be 0 revenue before the carbon project's inception. Of our sample, only 1 project had met these requirements, so 0.1% of overall sample projects. And to reach medium likelihood of additionality, relatively poor financial attractiveness must be demonstrated, which 3% of projects sampled achieved. To move on to options 2 and 3, you need to meet the medium likelihood of the IRR. So that's when you use the barrier analysis or the positive list. So 34% of our projects sampled and 32% had the barrier analysis and positive list respectively, but there are 0 projects that meet medium IRR and positive list, and only 12 projects that use barrier analysis and IRR. We still need further clarification on what will happen for the financial additionality measures for project types which currently do not mandate IRR. It is understood that an expert panel will apply figures based on sample data, literature, and expert judgment. And then once the project type criteria have been met, then the program level criteria comes in, so that's step 2 and 3. So that requires prior consideration of credits and consideration of legal requirements before the project's inception, as written in the registry's methodologies. As was shown in the previous slide, Gold Standard are the only registry which prescribe that there should be prior consideration of credits before the project start date, which equals 14% of total issuances, and ACR and CAR, together 24%, are the only registries which require prior consideration of legal requirements, i.e. a project cannot be considered additional if it is already legally required in the jurisdiction. So all in all, we get to the total of 0% of projects being able to pass the additionality benchmark. Registries will therefore need to adapt to meet both prior consideration and legal requirements steps. Now I'll give you a brief overview of the CCQI, which obviously preceded the CCPs, and much of the CCP methodology was built out from the CCQI methodology. However, it must be said that the CCQI is a rating system ensuring understanding of the underlying features of projects against 7 quality objectives. And this is scored on a 1 to 5 metric assigned for each criterion. Users apply the methodology at the project level, but indicative scores are only available for project types. And the next slide demonstrates the key rating criteria under the CCQI, with the exclamation marks again indicating the most impactful changes. And as you can see, that's pretty much mirrored onto the CCPs, but particularly worth highlighting again are the additionality and robust quantification sections, demonstrating, as the CCPs also do, the proof of credits to be considered before the start of activity, and a scoring in the permanent section of on a 1 to 5 basis, based on the guarantee of permanence from 1 to 100 years, which is novel to the CCQI. In the next slide, we can see a comparison between the number of detailed criteria between the CCQI and the CCP, which we went through as policy team, to sort of see exactly where they mapped onto each other precisely. And when lining up the requirements, you can basically see they're very similar, except that the CCPs have a much more thorough sustainable development and programme government sections. So they built those out on a much more stringent. I'm now going to hand over to Ben to discuss the ISSB.
Thanks, Maudie. So ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, it has a different role to play than the CCPs or the CCQI. As an international baseline, which would require corporate filers to disclose the use of carbon credits towards their emission targets, the ISSB has a unique potential to shift the market. To explain some of the background on the ISSB, it was built on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD framework, which many companies are now well acquainted with. And the ISSB has been received positively by several investor climate action networks and financial regulators. So at the base, countries and district jurisdictions will determine how to apply these standards, but where adopted, mandatory disclosures could increase the demand for carbon credits that can demonstrate additionality, permanence, and robust third-party validation. The ISSB Jurisdictional Working Group is tasked with enhancing compatibility between jurisdictions, and it involves several major economies, including those listed here. These jurisdictions represent only a few of those who will operationalize the ISSB standard, and it can be expected to be rolled out to many other countries as well. Trove's analysis indicates that 2/3 of the companies that do disclose their use of credits fell within these 4 jurisdictions, and those that do often fail to provide significant detail of carbon credit attributes. So when they do disclose that information, they often do it in an unstandardized way and they may need to change practices to meet the new requirements. On the next slide, we can see how the ISSB disclosure requirements are a significant departure from the status quo, as filers would need to disclose the criteria listed here to demonstrate the impact of these credits and align with the ISSB framework. It's worth noting that just 2 months ago, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, noted that financial institutions are still challenged by confidence in the quality and integrity of the claims behind the credits, as well as navigating the structures and the rigor of standards that are used to register credits. Corporates and investors need a way to assess the credibility and integrity of credits, but again, they depend on the market infrastructure as a basis for these assumptions. Thanks, Guy.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Maudie. So this is a very quick whistle-stop tour of a very involved subject. So to pull some of this together, and then I'll hand over to Chris. The image here was created or identified by my colleague Lucian, who's on the call, to sort of illustrate the upward path strewn with obstacles to some sunlit upland of uniformly agreed notions of credit of quality. But it's as you can see, it's a pretty slippery and difficult slope to climb. But let me just recap. quality and integrity are absolutely central to the VCM, particularly for this reason of baseline and credit structures which sit outside the notion of a cap. Standards are improving, registries are updating their procedures and methodologies, but clearly more work needs to be done. The ICVCM CCP set a higher bar. All registries would need to increase disclosure and adopt stricter measures to be compliant with those criteria. But are the steps too steep at this time? I guess the question that we'll dive into now, and Chris will comment on, is should we aim for perfection or incremental improvement? Perfection is difficult, near impossible to implement, and could potentially reduce investment if unachieved. But it does give the mantle of confidence to the investors and the buyers who want to make those claims. Incremental improvement, on the other hand, leaves the door open during the time of that improvement for critics to voice their concerns, to perhaps cherry pick or pick holes in certain projects, but keeps the investment train running and keeps the market functioning, which is ultimately the momentum that I think everybody wants to see continued. So it's a tricky one. And just one final sort of, as I was putting these slides together, I was reminded of a book that I read, and I don't know who, I wouldn't suppose many on the call were around in the 70s or 80s, but a very great book by Robert M. Piercing, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which deals with this issue of truth or quality, perfection, or is perfection and truth versus a notion of more nuanced concepts of quality. Should we strive for truth and perfection, or should we take our own more personalized view of what quality means? And the Greeks dealt with this even before then, and actually came to the conclusion that neither was the best way forward, and that when separating perfection or truth and quality leads to a source of much unhappiness and frustration. And perhaps this whole debate needs to be sort of converged towards a more common ground in that light. So something a little more philosophical to chew on at the end of quite a technical presentation. Chris, if I could hand the microphone to yourself and then hear what you have to say on the CCPs, etc., and then we'll go into more open Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Guy. And let me just quickly introduce myself, just to people who probably don't know me, and what my role is. So I'm the head of carbon markets development at Standard Chartered. I've been in the market for a long time. Guy and I first came across each other when we were doing carbon markets 1.0, I guess you would call it, when the EU ETS was set up back in 2005, and I've been involved in one way or other over the last few years, and in particular I was on the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon market. So I was part of the operating team and very heavily involved with that. Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered, was the chair. And then when the TSVCM set up the Integrity Council, and it's important to remember that the Integrity Council is the son or daughter of the TSVCM. It's direct linkage, direct line from there. I was fortunate enough to be voted on as one of the market representatives. There are 3 market representatives: myself, David Antonioli from Vera, and Jess Schwartz from BP. The rest of the board is independent in one form or another. They are either from NGOs, from various non-profits involved in the market, but they're not developing projects, or they're not involved in that whole piece of the market, and they're not coming from a commercial perspective. So I sit on there with another, I think it's there's 21 of us on the board. It's a large board, but it does work. And we spend a lot of time putting together these core carbon principles. This was the big recommendation of the task force, was to set up a governance body, the Integrity Council, and for the governance body to set up these core carbon principles, which we have done, or set them out. Now, the principles themselves are actually pretty simple when you look at them. I don't think there's anything hugely controversial with the principles. There are 10 principles. I think the big ones that have changed is this idea of a real positivity around projects. In the past, I think it was the idea of do no net harm. This is more around saying these projects have also got to be positive. They've got to actually add to local communities where they impact them, and to do something more than just reduce carbon emissions. So it's very much trying to bring that positivity. But other than that, the actual principles themselves are pretty familiar to most people. This idea of additionality, permanence, no double counting, all of these sorts of things. These are not new concepts, and they've been in the carbon markets for many years. And most of these projects, most of the project developers and the standards have them in one way or form. So the Integrity Council finally managed to release its consultation on the 27th of July this year, and this is after an awful lot of work of an expert body that we brought together. And I mean, the people on this body are very, very knowledgeable about the carbon markets and have been heavily involved in the carbon markets in one way or form over the years. They really do have a great body of knowledge and a great deal of experience. So I think most people would acknowledge that this is an extremely well thought through process. It's gone through an awful lot of scrutiny. And secondly, since the consultation was kicked off, we've done a lot of briefings. We've done a lot of work to go and reach out to people, to reach out to different groups across the spectrum, to get them to participate and to get involved in the consultation. The really, really important thing to remember is this is a consultation. This is not this is what we're going to do, and we're just letting you know. This is not a government consultation where basically all the decisions have been made. This is a consultation where we want your input. We want people to come in and say, what do you think is workable? What can actually work? What's practical here? But also, we are trying to, we're trying to really bring that integrity. So the integrity was used as one of the names, or one of the words in the title of the Integrity Council, for obvious reasons. We do believe integrity and quality are absolutely paramount, but it is through integrity. It's through that integrity that we expect to build scale, right? But the scale of high quality carbon credits, and carbon credits that have real credibility and real value that people will want to buy ultimately. But I think the other thing that we're trying to do is to create a high quality threshold standard, a consistency between the different standards, so that you can recognize, and so ultimately that a buyer will be able to say, if I buy a credit that's labeled CCP, that's basically been through that process, I know that it's high quality. I know that I bought something that meets the quality criteria that we need it to meet to make any claim that I'm going to make, if at all. And so that's really, really important, that people can just buy carbon credits that meet the CCPs and know that these are good quality, and that it doesn't matter whether they're from Vera, Gold Standard, or anywhere else for that matter. And it's about creating that high quality threshold, that consistency between the standards. But I think that it's very much true that the CCPs as they currently stand are very much at the high end of that integrity. And you've seen the number of credits that potentially could come through. It's very low under the current assessment. But that's why we want that input from people. It's about, we think, trying to set a benchmark, set a bar. Right now, obviously, we want to set that bar as high as possibly practical at this stage. But I think that there will be a lot of views in terms of seeing whether how the standards will meet the CCPs at the moment, and where we want to end up. So I think that the CCPs as they're drafted, and the assessment framework, which is actually the more important piece, it's how we apply the CCPs, is definitely aiming for a higher bar. But that bar may be something that we set over a period of time. Maybe that's a signal to where we actually want to end up. It's a direction of travel. But again, my point being, we want to hear people's views, and we want to see what can actually work, and how these principles can be applied. So most, as I say, most of the standards have got some. They meet the principles in some way or form, but maybe we'll need to look at a way that these principles and the assessment framework is applied consistently across the standard setters. So I mean, I think that's really all I've got to say at this time. It really is about getting that input, though. Yeah, there's a lot of people on this call. I hope they're all interested in parties in some way or form, and so anybody's open to make their comments, and we would encourage that. And as I say, there have been a number of sessions where we've reached out to people. We will continue to do that and try to explain the reasoning behind what we're doing, but also to listen to what people's views are. So the consultation ends on the 27th of September. We'll then go through those comments. Most of them, I think, if not all of them, will be made public, and our process in terms of actually assessing those comments and how we then integrate them into any changes will be also public. So this is very much being as transparent as possible to give people a real feeling that they've got a voice in this consultation, and that they will be listened to. So that's the process, and then we'll see where it goes from there in terms of actually getting a finalised set of CCPs and the assessment framework. But clearly, we're hoping to do that before the end of the year. But that at the moment is still open, an open question. So
Great.
with that, I guess I'll pass back to Guy.
Chris, do we have your presence for much longer, or do you have to duck off onto something?
I need to go at 4, so I'm here for some time longer.
All right, fine. Okay, just a quick question that's come through on the chat. There's one that I can just take off very quickly. What's the difference between the ICVCM and the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative? Well, just let me take that. We did a previous webinar on the VCMI's consultation. And we haven't dealt with it this time around because of that previous webinar. And the VCMI deals with really the buy side and what companies can claim and when and how they can use carbon credits and the target setting and commitment process that they're working on. So this webinar is really focused on the supply side and what initiatives are driving that. So that deals with that question. A really interesting question that if I could punt to you, Chris, while you're here. What happens to projects that are in the process of being developed, or might happen to the projects which are in the process of being developed whilst the CCPs are being developed and refined and agreed upon? The gestation of a project can take many, many years. How would you react to people saying, well, what should I expect, and how should this change the course of my investment and project development cycle? You're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that it doesn't change anything as such, but I think that you've got to keep it. Remember, what we're doing here is we're trying to create a label. Right. This is not a case of your credit's good, your credit's bad. This is just a label. I hope that everybody will aspire to want to have your project labeled as core carbon. We hope that will create a assurance for buyers, and so that they can come in and they know that they're buying good quality carbon credits. They meet this high threshold, a consistent threshold across the standards. But it's not going to change anything in terms of how your project is being assessed from a program's perspective. And of course, obviously, there may be certain things that programs will have to do to change the way that they go about that assessment, and also about how the VVB, the validation, verification, and measurement works as well going forward. But these are all things that we just need to be aware of. And I think that, again, what the assessment framework and what the consultation does is it shows the direction of travel. We will. There is some way to go before we get a final version of the CCPs and the assessment framework. But I think you can see where we're headed. Whether that's exactly what we're looking at for the initial piece, I think is obviously something that is obviously, that's an open question, and I really don't know the answer to that, because again, that's we're waiting to hear what the responses are, and how we then react to that. One other just point to make is that the voluntary market is self-correcting and has been self-correcting over many years. If you think about what Vera has done recently with with renewable credits. And okay, this is obviously, not everybody has to do the same thing, but they've made a decision. So they've said that renewable credits that are from grid connected projects in middle income countries won't be going forward. They won't be validated. They won't be registered as carbon crediting programs. Carbon crediting projects. They made a decision on that. They went through an assessment on that, and that's the decision that they came to. And their view being that renewable projects, grid connected renewable projects, are effectively cost effective and cost competitive with fossil fuels. They don't need support. Remember, that's the whole point of carbon projects and carbon markets. It's about providing financial support to projects that otherwise would not happen without that financial support, right? That's the whole idea behind it. That we're creating a support mechanism. So if they don't no longer need a support, then they shouldn't obviously get carbon credits. That's the kind of key principle behind it, and that's the way that it's worked. And in fact, if you think about that, this is a positive thing. We're seeing money coming into the markets. It's helping to improve technology. It gets to the point where it no longer needs that money, and therefore it can stand on its own feet. So that's a positive action. It's the way that the market, as I say, is self-correcting. Now, there's certain projects that you'll need to see continued funding for a longer period of time, because that's the nature of them. And I think most of the nature-based projects are a little bit like that. But we're always looking at improving. Again, if you look at all of the standards, and we saw it alluded to earlier on, they continue to improve their processes, and they continue to improve the way that they operate. And so this will happen. This will continue. That's always going to be the case. And what we're seeing with the CCPs is a way that you can see how that can be done in a consistent way, a measurable way across the different standards, and so that people are less confused. They know that any credit that meets the CCPs is a high quality carbon credit in the first place.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. We've had a flurry of questions come in. Apologies, we're not able to get to all of them, but there was a very interesting one on reductions versus removals, and if I could throw the hot potato over to Lucian, who's been conspicuously silent, who leads our policy team here. Do you want to answer that one, Lucian?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Guy. I think it's a really great question, and I think it's going to become increasingly more important that we're able to distinguish them in the markets. Outside of the core carbon principles themselves, one of the things that the ICVCM has proposed is that there will be additional criteria tags for credits, and one of those would be reduction, whether it is a reduction or a removal. So, and I think we've already seen announcements from the American Carbon Registry that they will have a system within their registry for tagging credits as being a reduction or removal, even within project types, where there is a project type that could issue potentially both a reduction or a removal. In the example they have is improved forest management. So it's a really great point. I think how we're going to get to that point of establishing those boundaries of what is a reduction, what is a removal, and standardizing that across the registries. I think that there's much discussion left on that, but there is the wheels are in motion to create an infrastructure for that.
Great, thank you, Chris, Lucian, and Guy for your comments. We've had a few specific questions on the Q&A chat, so I'm just going to go through those, and whoever is most appropriate can answer them on your guys' side. So first, a couple of questions around the CCPs. So we have listeners asking us to clarify what is meant by financial additionality, and then perhaps if we could expand on why we consider additionality under the ICVCM so controversial. For example, is the wording stricter than expected? And if so, many projects fail the proposed additionality requirements. Is it fair to say that the new CCP criteria might not be achievable?
Well, can I take the first stab at those very, very quickly?
Of course.
Well, first of all, on the last question, we don't consider the definition of financial additionality is pretty clear. It is whether or not the project would have gone ahead in the absence of the carbon credit, and that's a very simple thing to say. It's far more difficult to actually prove. And that's where I think the controversy lies, is in the amount of evidence and the objectivity of that evidence to be able to make that claim. We don't consider it to be controversial at Trove. Those triangles that Mordy showed are on what is basically a representation of the feedback that we've had from market participants against those. So the aim of the CCPs is well meant, and as Chris said, does drive the process towards a unified, higher quality outcome. It's just the gnashing of teeth that's going to be required to get there, and that's what those symbols represent. So we don't consider what the CCPs have done as controversial at all. But the devil is in the detail in terms of how it's implemented. And sorry, you had another, there were 3 wrapped up there, Ashley. What was your third one?
Yes, so the others were, is it because the wording is stricter than expected? And if so, many projects fail the proposed requirements. Is it fair to say that the CCP criteria may not be achievable?
Well, on the basis of statistics and the way, if you were to retroactively apply it, the point is there's a difference between retroactively applying the PCCPs as they're currently drafted to projects which have been around for 5, 10, 15 years, and those going forwards. So I don't think the difference that we've highlighted statistically between the compliance of existing projects against those CCPs is necessarily indicative of how new projects coming in should be developed. So I think it's setting the bar for the future rather than applying it retroactively.
Great, thank you. And our next question is, we have had a couple of questions surrounding REDD+ projects and the future outlook of those projects. So saying there seems to be a move that seems to move in the direction of excluding these credits from several platforms. How do you see the future of REDD+ projects and their acceptance in the VCM?
Who would like to take that one? Lucian or Mordy?
Yeah, perhaps Lucian.
Yep, I'm happy to jump in there. Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Ashley. I think broadly, in terms of the future outlook of REDD+ projects, I think we're seeing from a lot of organisations involved in the carbon market space a move towards viewing jurisdictional scale REDD+ or the nesting of projects within a jurisdictional baseline as being the path forward to sort of a higher integrity implementation of REDD+ projects in the future. So I think there is a very important role in terms of supplying emissions reductions to the market, and especially for, we're starting to see what the guidance might be, for example, from the SBTI on what beyond value chain mitigation should look like on the road towards net zero. So there's a huge role, I think, for REDD+ as one of the largest slices of reduction rather than removal credits. But we're seeing this move that we expect that the market will see nested or projects nested under jurisdictional baselines or the jurisdictional credits themselves as being a higher integrity implementation of the REDD+ idea.
Great, thank you, Lucian. We have another question on the CCP. So looking at the sustainable development impact of projects beyond carbon, please can you expand a bit more on exactly what the CCP requires here? There are some questions with some specific examples, which I'm not sure that we can answer off the top of our head, but perhaps you can talk about what is being proposed here. Maybe Mordy, if you'd like to take this one.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of the sustainability stuff is to do with non-invasive species introduction. I think that was quite a lot of what the biodiversity area of the sustainable part of the CCPs covered. But there's also a huge amount on social development and gender equality and ensuring just project integrity on the ground, which is very welcome, and why that had to be such a long section is that it hasn't been ensured yet, as it's often considered a co-benefit and not integral to the project at its heart, due to it not affecting the carbon score. But obviously now, where we are with the VCM, it's being considered a much more important part.
Great, thank you, Maudie. I think we have time for one more question. So, Guy, maybe this one's for you. What sort of price impact might we expect from the final publication of the ISSB guidelines? Might we see a short-term tightening of supply due to an increase in standards? What are your thoughts on that?
Judging by the way in which the carbon credit market, not just the voluntary market, but the CDM prior to that has evolved over the last 15 years, I wouldn't expect there to be a material shift, because I would doubt that the principles would be applied retrospectively. It may change perceptions of certain projects. But as Maudie and the team showed, there's a huge lack of information to be able to apply the CCPs based on the disclosures that are actually made in the registries. So I think it will be a very gradual process for those two reasons. And I don't expect there to be a sort of Damocles sort of hanging over the market, either, you know, from a price sort of uplift or depression point of view. I think it would be quite a gradual impact. But maybe Chris, I mean, I don't know if you're allowed to mention your views on that, but I think it would be it's going to be a longer process rather than a cliff edge.
Yeah, I think you're right, as you say, because even if you know, wherever the bar is, you know, ends up, it will take time for, you know, some time for these projects to all meet that standard and for projects to get issued. Now, people will take a view on certain projects, I assume, and, you know, decide whether they're in or out, and that will impact the market, I'm sure. But as you say, it will require people like Trove and others providing analysis and information on the market to help them to help guide them and to create that value.
That's a good word to end on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much to everyone who contributed to our webinar today. A special thanks to Chris for joining as our guest speaker, and also a special thanks to the Trove policy team for creating a wonderful deck. Just to let you guys know, the webinar recording and slides will be available for public download tomorrow on the Trove Research website. And if you have any questions regarding anything you saw in today's webinar, please email me at ashni.patel@trove-research.com. Thank you all for attending. Speak to you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Bye.